At 19, Rachel Colton was handed over to a Modoc war chief to settle her uncle's whiskey debt, a transaction that should have ended her life as she knew it. She believed she was being sent to die among savages in a godless camp beyond civilization's reach. But what unfolded in those wild borderlands would ignite a conflict that brought federal troops, newspaper reporters, and the weight of two colliding worlds crashing down on a single woman who refused to disappear. The wagon lurched over another rock, and Rachel gripped the splintered sideboard until her knuckles blanched white. Her uncle Silas sat hunched on the driver's bench, reins loose in his weathered hands, eyes fixed on the horizon like a man watching his own funeral procession. He hadn't spoken since they'd left Fort Klamath 3 hours before dawn, hadn't looked at her, hadn't offered water when the sun climbed high enough to turn the alkali flats into a shimmering hell. She'd stopped asking questions after the first mile. What was the point? The answers had all come 2 nights ago in the back room of McCrady's saloon, when Silas had stumbled home, reeking of rotgut and desperation, and told her she was leaving. Not going, leaving. As in sold, as in traded, as in her entire existence, reduced to a line item in a ledger book kept by men who dealt in pelts, whiskey, and human beings with equal indifference. "How much did you owe him?" Rachel had asked that night, her voice surprisingly steady despite the way the cabin walls seemed to be closing in. Silas had collapsed into the chair by the cold fireplace, head in his hands. $300, he'd muttered. "Maybe more. I stopped counting after the 4th bottle. $300. The sum was incomprehensible. Their entire homestead, the 40 acres Silas had claimed 5 years ago, the half-built barn, the 3 scrawny cattle, might fetch $200 if they were lucky. Her uncle had gambled away more than they owned, and now she was the collateral. "Nightbear don't want money," Silas had continued, his voice hollow. "He wants a bridge. That's what he called it. A bridge between his people and ours. Says if he takes a white woman as wife, shows respect for our ways, maybe the settlers will stop trying to push the Modoc off the lava beds. Maybe the army will back off." He'd finally looked at her then, and Rachel had seen something worse than guilt in his bloodshot eyes. Relief. He was relieved to have found a solution that didn't require him to face consequences. "You'll be treated well," he'd added quickly. "Nightbear's got a reputation. Fair man keeps his word. You won't be harmed." Rachel had wanted to scream that being sold to a stranger, Modoc or otherwise, was harm. That ripping her away from everything she knew, from the grave where her parents lay buried, from the life she'd been trying to build, was violence regardless of how fair her new owner proved to be. But she'd learned years ago that screaming accomplished nothing. So instead, she'd asked the only question that mattered. "And if I refuse?" Silas had looked away. "Then Nightbear takes the homestead, and me. He's got legal claim through the territorial court. Some judge in Jacksonville who owes him favors. We lose everything and I go to debtor's prison, or worse. So really there was no choice at all. Now as the wagon crested a rise and the Modoc encampment came into view, Rachel felt her stomach clench with a fear so visceral she tasted copper. The settlement sprawled across a rocky plateau bordered by twisted juniper and sage, with the jagged black lava beds rising like a fortress wall to the east. Canvas tents mixed with traditional tule lodges and smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns against the painfully blue sky. Figures moved between the structures, women in buckskin dresses, children chasing dogs, men working hides or repairing weapons. It looked disturbingly normal. Rachel had expected something more savage, more barbaric. Instead, it looked like any frontier camp, just organized differently. "That's his lodge," Silas said, breaking his silence to point at a large structure near the camp's center. It was bigger than the others, made from tule reeds woven tight enough to shed rain, with a hide flap covering the entrance. 2 men stood guard outside, both armed with rifles that looked painfully new. "Nathan Cross, that's Nightbear's white name. He's practical. Keeps peace with traders, speaks better English than most settlers." "You could do worse." Rachel didn't answer. She was watching a tall figure emerge from the lodge. And even at this distance, she knew it was him. Nightbear stood well over 6 feet, his frame lean but powerful, in the way of men who'd spent their lives surviving in harsh country. He wore a mix of Modoc and settler clothing, buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt, a beaded vest that caught the light. His hair was long, black as charcoal, with 2 hawk feathers tied into a braid that hung over his left shoulder. But it was his face that caught Rachel's attention. Sharp-featured, copper-skinned, with eyes so dark they looked black from a distance. He watched their approach with an expression that revealed nothing, neither welcome nor hostility. Just assessment. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop 30 feet from the lodge. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Nightbear stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He stopped beside Rachel's side of the wagon and looked up at her. Up close, she could see the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting into sun and smoke, and something else, an intelligence that made her deeply uneasy because it meant he wasn't the savage brute she'd half hoped he'd be. Brutes were predictable. Intelligent men were dangerous. Rachel Colton, he said, his voice low and rough-edged, but his English flawless. It wasn't a question. Silas had already provided all relevant details. Yes, Rachel managed, her throat dry as sand. Nightbear extended his hand, not to help her down, she realized, but in greeting. A white man's gesture. She stared at it, this offering of civility in the midst of her enslavement, and felt anger flare hot in her chest. "I'm not here by choice," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "I know," Nightbear replied, hand still extended. "Neither was I." The statement hung in the air between them, strange and weighted with meaning Rachel didn't understand. She looked at his hand, at his impassive face, and realized that refusing the gesture would change nothing about her situation, but might make it worse. She took his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, and brief. He released her immediately and stepped back. "Your uncle and I have business to conclude," he said. "Tall grass woman will show you to your place," he gestured. And an older Modoc woman appeared from behind the lodge, her weathered face neutral, but her eyes curious. Rachel climbed down from the wagon on shaking legs. Behind her, she heard Silas and Nightbear speaking in low tones, but she couldn't make out the words over the rushing in her ears. Tall grass woman approached, said something in Modoc, then switched to heavily accented English when Rachel stared blankly. "Come, you eat, you rest. Tomorrow, ceremony. Ceremony." The word hit Rachel like a fist. Marriage. They were actually going to go through with a marriage ceremony. As if this transaction needed religious or cultural sanction to make it legitimate. "I won't," Rachel said, her voice rising. "I won't participate in some mockery of marriage." "You can't make me." Tall grass woman's expression shifted to something almost pitying. "You hear? You stay. Ceremony, just words. Words change nothing." The brutal pragmatism of the statement silenced Rachel more effectively than threats could have. The older woman was right. She was here. Whether they spoke words over her or not, her situation remained the same. Fighting the ceremony was fighting a symbol while ignoring the substance. Still, some stubborn part of her refused to simply submit. Nightbear had finished with Silas. Rachel's uncle climbed back onto the wagon bench without looking at her. Without saying goodbye, without offering even a pretense of regret. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched into motion. Rachel watched it go, watched the only connection to her old life disappear into the dust and heat shimmer, and felt something inside her calcify. If she was going to survive this, she couldn't afford sentiment, couldn't afford hope. She needed to become stone. "Come," Tall Grass Woman repeated, her tone gentler now. Rachel followed her through the camp, acutely aware of the eyes tracking her movement. Women paused in their work. Children stopped their games. Men watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion, to something that might have been sympathy. Rachel kept her head up, her spine straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Tall Grass Woman led her to a smaller lodge near the edge of camp, pulled aside the hide covering, and gestured inside. The interior was dim and cool, smelling of sage and smoke. A sleeping platform covered with buffalo robes occupied one side. Clay pots, woven baskets, and what looked like spare clothing filled the other. A small fire pit sat in the center, currently cold. "You stay here tonight," Tallgrass Woman said. "Tomorrow you move to Nightbear's lodge." "Tonight you alone." Rachel stepped inside, and the hide flap fell closed behind her, cutting off the harsh sunlight. She stood in the dimness, breathing hard, her mind racing. She needed to think, needed to plan. There had to be a way out of this, a way to escape, to get to Fort Klamath or Jacksonville, somewhere with law and order and people who wouldn't tolerate the selling of white women to Modoc chiefs. But even as she thought it, she knew it was fantasy. Fort Klamath was 3 days' hard ride through country she didn't know, populated by settlers who'd shoot a lone woman for her boots. Jacksonville was even farther, and by the time she reached it, Nightbear could simply produce whatever legal documents he'd filed with the territorial court. She'd been claimed legally, which meant the law wouldn't help her. In fact, the law had enabled this. Some judge had signed papers making her uncle's debt transferable, making her a piece of property that could be handed over in settlement. Rachel sank onto the sleeping platform, her legs finally giving out. For the first time since Silas had told her she was leaving, she allowed herself to cry, not sobbing, but silent tears that tracked down her dust-caked cheeks and dripped onto her calico dress. She cried for her parents, dead 6 years from cholera. She cried for the dreams she'd had of teaching school in Portland, of maybe meeting a kind man and building a life based on choice rather than necessity. She cried for the girl she'd been yesterday, who'd still believed the world operated on principles of justice and fairness. The hide flap rustled. Rachel jerked upright, swiping at her tears. A young Modoc woman entered, carrying a clay pot and a bundle of cloth. She was perhaps Rachel's age, with delicate features and quick, intelligent eyes. She set the pot down, water, Rachel realized, and unfolded the cloth to reveal a simple buckskin dress. "For tomorrow," the young woman said in careful English. "Your dress." She gestured at Rachel's calico, which was indeed filthy from travel. "Not right for ceremony. I'm not changing," Rachel said flatly. The young woman studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "As you wish. But Tallgrass Woman will be angry." She paused at the entrance, looked back. "My name is Willowsong. Nightbear is my cousin. He is a good man. He will not hurt you." Before Rachel could respond, she was gone. Rachel stared at the buckskin dress, at the water pot, at the carefully prepared space that was supposed to become her prison cell. Everyone kept telling her Nightbear was good, fair, honorable, as if those qualities somehow negated the fundamental horror of her situation, as if being sold to a kind master was supposed to make slavery acceptable. She picked up the water pot and drank deeply, her throat raw. Then she lay back on the buffalo robes and stared at the smoke hole in the lodge's peak, watching the sky fade from blue to purple to black. She must have slept, because when she jolted awake, the lodge was pitch dark and voices were arguing outside. Rachel pressed herself against the back wall, heart hammering. The voices were male, speaking rapid Modoc. She caught Nightbear's distinctive low tone and another voice, younger, angrier. The conversation grew heated, then silence. The hide flap lifted and Nightbear ducked inside. Rachel scrambled to her feet, but he made no move toward her. Instead, he crouched by the cold fire pit, his face shadowed. "Tomorrow, after the ceremony, you will have 2 choices," he said without preamble. "You can accept this arrangement and learn our ways. You'll be treated as my wife. You'll have status, protection, a voice in camp decisions. Or you can fight it. You can resist, try to escape, refuse to participate in camp life. If you choose that path, you'll be guarded, confined, and eventually you'll break. I've seen it happen to captives. It's not something I want for you. You want me to just accept being property?" Rachel's voice shook with fury. "You want me to smile and play wife to the man who bought me like livestock?" Nightbear finally looked up, and in the faint starlight filtering through the smoke hole, his eyes were hard. "I want you to survive. This is the frontier, Rachel Colton. Survival looks different here than in your uncle's cabin. Your choices aren't between freedom and slavery. They're between different kinds of captivity. You were captive to your uncle's debts, to a homestead that was failing, to a future with no prospects. Now you're captive here. The question is whether you'll be a prisoner or a participant. There's a difference?" Rachel shot back. "In outcome, no. In experience, yes." He stood, and even in the darkness his presence filled the small space. "Tomorrow we speak words. You can speak them willingly or under duress. Either way, the words will be spoken. After that you'll move to my lodge. You'll have your own sleeping area. I won't force you to share my bed, that's not our way. When and if you choose that, it will be your decision." The statement stunned Rachel into silence. She'd assumed, she'd been certain, that her first night as Nightbear's wife would end in violation. That was what happened to women who were sold or captured, wasn't it? "You're saying you won't touch me?" she finally managed. "I'm saying I won't rape you," Nightbear corrected bluntly. "There's a difference between a wife and a slave in Modoc culture. My first wife, she died 3 winters ago. She chose me. We courted for a year before we married. I won't dishonor her memory by treating you as less than she was treated." He moved toward the entrance, then paused. "You want to know why I agreed to your uncle's proposal? Why I'm willing to take a wife who hates me?" Rachel said nothing, but he continued anyway. "Because in 2 months, maybe less, the army is going to march on this camp. They're going to demand we relocate to the Klamath Reservation, where my people will starve on bad land, while white settlers take these lava beds. Having a white wife, showing I'm willing to bridge our worlds, might buy us time, might give me leverage to negotiate better terms. You're not just a debt payment, Rachel Colton. You're a political strategy, and if you're smart, you'll use that." He left. Rachel stood frozen in the darkness, her mind reeling. She'd been so focused on her own captivity that she hadn't considered the larger context, the territorial conflicts, the pressure on Modoc lands, the coming confrontation Nightbear clearly saw approaching. He'd framed her as a victim, but he'd also just handed her information that could be used. If she was a political strategy, then she had value beyond her body. Value meant leverage, and leverage meant possibility. Rachel sat back down on the sleeping platform, her racing thoughts beginning to organize themselves into something resembling a plan. She couldn't escape, not yet, probably not for months. But she could observe. She could learn. She could figure out who had power in this camp, what alliances existed, where the fractures were. Nightbear had gambled that she'd be too broken or too compliant to use the information he'd just given her. He was wrong. The next morning, Tall Grass Woman came to dress her. Rachel had decided during the sleepless hours before dawn to wear the buckskin dress, not as capitulation, but as camouflage. If she was going to learn anything useful, she needed to be seen as adapting, not as a constant threat. The dress fit reasonably well, and Tall Grass Woman braided Rachel's dark blonde hair in a style that mixed Modoc and settler aesthetics. "You look good," the older woman said approvingly. "Nightbear will be pleased." The ceremony took place at noon, with the full camp gathered in a circle around Nightbear's lodge. Rachel stood beside him, her face carefully blank, while a Modoc elder spoke words she didn't understand. Nightbear translated quietly. "He's asking the spirits to bless our union, to bring children, to make our home prosperous." Rachel's jaw clenched at the mention of children, but she remained silent. When the elder finished, Nightbear produced a beaded necklace and fastened it around Rachel's throat. The beads were blue and white, arranged in a pattern she didn't recognize. "Now you," the elder said in English, gesturing to Rachel. She was supposed to give Nightbear something in return, but she had nothing. No jewelry, no token, nothing but her mother's jade hairpin still tucked in her pocket. For a wild moment, she considered refusing, just standing there and letting the ceremony collapse into awkwardness. But then she remembered Nightbear's words, "You're a political strategy, use that." She pulled out the hairpin, the only thing she owned that had any value, and held it out. Nightbear stared at it, clearly recognizing the gesture's significance. He took the pin carefully, as if it were made of glass, and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly, and for the first time, something like respect flickered in his eyes. The ceremony concluded with a meal. roasted venison, camas root berries. Rachel forced herself to eat, to nod when spoken to present the image of a woman adjusting to her new circumstances. Inside, she was cataloguing everything. Which men seemed loyal to Nightbear, which looked skeptical. How the women organized themselves, where weapons were stored. How the camp's perimeter was guarded. That evening, as promised, Rachel moved to Nightbear's lodge. It was larger than the one she'd slept in, divided into sections by hanging blankets. He showed her to an area in the back, separated by buffalo hide for privacy. "Your space," he said simply. "No one will enter without permission." Rachel set down her few possessions and turned to face him. "What happens now?" she asked. Nightbear settled by the central fire, began cleaning his rifle. "Now we wait, you learn, I prepare. And when the army comes, we see if this arrangement was worth the cost." Rachel sat on her sleeping platform, watching him work, and realized with cold clarity that she was trapped in something far more complex than simple captivity. She was a pawn in a game played across cultural and political lines, and every move she made would have consequences she couldn't fully predict. But she was also still alive, still conscious, still capable of thought and action. Her mother's final words came back to her, whispered during those last fevered hours. "Stay alive, Rachel. As long as you're alive, you can fight." Rachel intended to do exactly that. Rachel's first week in Nightbear's lodge passed in careful observation and silent calculation. She woke before dawn each day to the sound of the camp stirring, children's voices, the scrape of hide being stretched, the rhythmic thud of women grinding camas root into flour. Nightbear left early most mornings, returning only for brief meals before disappearing again into meetings with his council or ranging the perimeter with his warriors. He spoke to Rachel only when necessary, their exchanges clipped and functional. "We're low on water. Willow Song will show you the spring," or "Stay near camp today. There are soldiers scouting north of the lava beds." She learned the camp's rhythms through observation rather than instruction. Tallgrass Woman and Willow Song took turns showing her tasks, how to scrape hides without tearing them, which plants were edible and which were poison, how to weave tool reeds tight enough to shed rain. The work was endless and exhausting, her hands blistering and bleeding until they finally calloused over. But Rachel welcomed the physical labor because it gave her access to the women's conversations, and the women knew everything that mattered. "Blue Jacket is pushing for war," she heard one woman murmur to another while they worked hides near the central fire. "He says Nightbear's white wife proves he's gone soft, that he cares more about peace than defending our land." The second woman glanced toward where Rachel sat grinding grain 20 feet away, clearly uncertain whether she understood enough Modoc to follow the conversation. Rachel kept her expression blank, her movements steady, giving no indication she'd heard anything. Blue Jacket. The name came up repeatedly in hushed conversations, always with an undertone of tension. Rachel pieced together that he was Nightbear's cousin, younger by perhaps 5 years, a war chief who commanded significant respect among the younger warriors. He'd opposed the marriage publicly, calling it a betrayal of Modoc sovereignty. Nightbear had overruled him, citing the practical necessity of showing willingness to negotiate with settlers. The camp had split along generational lines. Older members supported Nightbear's pragmatism. Younger ones rallied behind Blue Jacket's militancy. Rachel filed this information away carefully. A divided camp was vulnerable, and vulnerability created opportunities. She didn't yet know what kind of opportunity she was looking for. Escape still seemed impossible given the isolation and the guards Nightbear posted at the camp. Perimeter, but knowledge was its own form of power. Her mother had taught her that during the lean years after her father's death, men think women don't understand politics because we're not in their councils. But we hear everything. We just have to listen. On the 8th day, Rachel was returning from the spring with Willow Song when they encountered Blue Jacket. He stood blocking the path, flanked by 2 younger warriors, his expression openly hostile. He was shorter than Nightbear, but more powerfully built, with a brutal scar running from his left ear to his collarbone. He spoke in rapid Modoc, his tone sharp enough that Rachel didn't need translation to know she was the subject. Willow Song responded quietly, her body language placating, but Blue Jacket cut her off. He stepped closer to Rachel, near enough that she could smell the bear grease in his hair, and spoke in heavily accented English. "You are poison here. White woman bringing white ways. Nightbear thinks you make peace. You make weakness." Rachel met his stare, refusing to look away despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I didn't choose to be here," she said evenly. "Take that up with your cousin!" Blue Jacket's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward. The water basket tumbled from her grip, spilling across the rocky ground. "You think you have protection? You think Nightbear will always be there?" His grip tightened until Rachel felt bones grinding together. "He makes mistake. And when army comes, when soldiers burn this camp, we remember who brought them. Release her." Nightbear's voice cut through the confrontation like a rifle shot. He materialized from between the juniper trees, his rifle held loose but ready. Blue Jacket held Rachel's wrist a moment longer, a deliberate show of defiance, then shoved her backward. She stumbled, and Willow Song caught her. The two cousins faced each other, and the air between them vibrated with tension that went far deeper than Rachel's presence. Nightbear spoke in Modoc, his tone cold and controlled. Blue Jacket responded with equal ice. The exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but Rachel could read the subtext in their postures. This wasn't about her, specifically, but about leadership, about strategy, about which path the Modoc would take when the inevitable confrontation came. Finally, Blue Jacket spat on the ground near Nightbear's feet and stalked away, his warriors trailing behind. Nightbear turned to Rachel, his expression unreadable. "Are you hurt?" She cradled her wrist, which was already bruising. "Nothing permanent." He nodded once, then looked at Willow Song. "Take her back to camp. Stay with her until I return." As they walked away, Rachel heard Nightbear's footsteps heading in the opposite direction, not toward camp, but deeper into the lava beds where the council met in private. That night, Rachel lay awake on her sleeping platform, listening to the sounds of argument drifting from the council fire. She couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. Accusations, defenses, anger. She heard Nightbear's voice raised once, rare enough that it sent a chill down her spine, and then silence. When he finally returned to the lodge well past midnight, she pretended to sleep but watched through slitted eyes as he sat by the banked fire, head in his hands, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. The fracture in the camp widened over the following days. Warriors began gathering in two distinct groups. Those loyal to Nightbear congregated near the central fire, while Blue Jacket's followers claimed territory near the eastern edge of camp. Women moved between the groups uneasily, trying to maintain neutrality. Children picked up the tension and grew quieter, their games subdued. Even the dogs seemed on edge, growling at shadows. Rachel found herself caught in the middle in ways she hadn't anticipated. The older women, particularly tall grass woman, treated her with increasing warmth, as if her presence represented Nightbear's commitment to survival over pride. The younger warriors openly despised her, seeing her as evidence of their leader's capitulation, and the women her own age existed in an uncomfortable middle ground, neither hostile nor friendly, watching to see which way the wind would blow. It was Willow Song who finally explained the depth of the problem. They were processing a deer hide together, the repetitive work creating a space for quiet conversation. "Blue Jacket lost his wife last winter," Willow Song said softly, her hands never stopping their motion. "Settlers attacked her gathering party north of here. She was carrying their first child. Blue Jacket found her 3 days later." Rachel's hands stilled. "I didn't know. How could you? We don't speak of it to outsiders, but that's why he hates you. Not you personally, what you represent. Every white face is the face of the man who killed his family." Willow Song glanced up, her expression pained. "Nightbear understands this. That's why he tolerates Blue Jacket's challenges. But tolerance has limits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happens when those limits are reached? Rachel asked. Willowsong's answer was oblique but chilling. Among our people, leadership is proven, not inherited. If enough warriors lose faith in a chief's judgment, they can challenge him. Sometimes the challenge is ritual. Sometimes it's blood. Rachel absorbed this information with growing unease. She'd assumed her greatest danger came from external threats, soldiers, hostile settlers, the wilderness itself. She hadn't considered that she might be the catalyst for internal collapse. The crisis came 2 weeks after the confrontation at the spring. Rachel woke to shouting and emerged from the lodge to find the camp in chaos. A rider had arrived during the night with news. Federal troops were mustering at Fort Klamath, preparing to march on the lava beds within the week. Their orders were to relocate all Modoc inhabitants to the Klamath Reservation by force, if necessary. Any resistance would be met with military action. Nightbear stood in the center of camp, surrounded by his council. Blue Jacket faced him across the fire circle, his warriors arrayed behind him. Rachel hung back near the lodge entrance, but she could hear every word of the confrontation. Blue Jacket was arguing in English now, ensuring everyone understood. You said the White Wife would buy us time. You said showing cooperation would make them see us as civilized, as worthy of negotiation. Where is this time? Where is this negotiation? All I see is an army preparing to drive us from our land like animals. Nightbear's response was measured but firm. If we had not shown willingness to adapt, they would already be here. These 2 weeks gave us time to prepare defenses, to move our elders and children to the deep caves, to cache supplies. Would you rather we had no warning at all? Blue Jacket stepped forward, his voice rising. I would rather we had our dignity. I would rather we died fighting than lived as dogs begging for scraps on a reservation that will starve us. And the children? Nightbear's voice cut like a blade. The elders? The women? You want them to die for your pride? The question hung in the air, and Rachel saw some of Blue Jacket's supporters shift uncomfortably. But Blue Jacket himself didn't flinch. I want them to die free if they must die at all. You've forgotten what it means to be Modoc. You've let this white woman poison you with her ways. Nightbear moved so fast, Rachel barely tracked it. One moment he was standing still. The next, he had Blue Jacket by the throat, lifted almost off his feet. Speak about strategy, speak about tactics, speak about my judgment, Nightbear growled, his voice deadly quiet. But if you question my loyalty to our people again, cousin or not, I will answer that challenge in the old way. For a long moment, the entire camp held its breath. Then Blue Jacket's hands came up, palms out. Not quite submission, but acknowledgement. Nightbear released him, stepped back. Blue Jacket massaged his throat, his expression unreadable. The council will decide, he said finally. Let every voice be heard. Let the people choose, war or surrender. The council convened immediately, and to Rachel's shock, Nightbear turned to her before entering the council lodge. You'll attend, he said. What? Why? Because you're Modoc now by law and ceremony. And because if we're deciding whether to fight an enemy that includes your people, you deserve to hear the reasoning. It was a trap of some kind, Rachel was certain. But she followed him into the lodge anyway. The council lodge was dim and smoky, lit only by a central fire. 20 men and 5 women sat in a circle. The elders, the war chiefs, the clan leaders. Rachel took a position behind Nightbear, trying to make herself invisible. But Blue Jacket immediately objected to her presence. She has no voice here. She's barely been among us a month. Nightbear didn't even look at his cousin. She has more right than most. The army is coming partly because settlers fear Modoc raids. She can speak to whether those fears are justified, whether there's any path to coexistence. One of the elders, a wizened man named Grey Cloud, gestured for silence. Let the white woman speak. I would hear her thoughts. Rachel felt every eye turn to her. Her mouth went dry. She hadn't prepared for this, hadn't expected to be put in a position of having to defend or condemn either side. Finally, she found her voice. I don't know if coexistence is possible, she said carefully. I've seen too many settlers who view this land as empty, waiting to be claimed, who see your people as obstacles, not neighbors." Blue Jacket made a sound of vindication, but Rachel continued. "But I've also seen what happens when tribes fight the army directly. I was at Fort Klamath 3 years ago when they brought in the survivors from the Rogue River Wars. Entire villages destroyed, women and children dead or scattered. The warriors who fought bravely are all in graves now, and their people are on reservations anyway, with no land and no leverage to negotiate better terms." "So you counsel surrender," Blue Jacket said, his tone scathing. "I counsel survival," Rachel shot back, surprised by her own vehemence. "Nightbear is right that having a white wife gives you something to negotiate with. It proves you're willing to adapt, to find common ground. That's not weakness, it's strategy, but only if you actually use it. If you just wait for the army to arrive and then either fight or surrender, the marriage was pointless." Grey Cloud leaned forward. "What do you suggest, White Daughter?" The term startled Rachel, but she pressed on. "Send envoys to Fort Klamath now, before the troops march. Use me as evidence that you're seeking peace. Demand a meeting with the territorial governor. Make them negotiate terms before it becomes a military action. Once soldiers are deployed, negotiation becomes impossible." The council erupted in argument. Some supported the idea, others called it naive. Blue Jacket laughed outright. "You think white leaders will negotiate in good faith? They want our land. Words won't change that?" Nightbear finally spoke. "No, but words might buy us time to prepare stronger defenses. And if the negotiations fail publicly, if settlers see that we tried for peace and were refused, some of them might question the army's actions, might refuse to support the land seizure." The debate raged for hours. Rachel sat in silence, exhausted by the weight of having spoken, of having potentially influenced decisions that would affect dozens of lives. Finally, Grey Cloud called for a decision. The vote was close, but Nightbear's proposal carried. They would send a delegation to Fort Klamath, led by Nightbear himself, with Rachel accompanying as living proof of Modoc willingness to bridge cultures. They would demand negotiation, and if negotiation failed, they would retreat to the lava beds and prepare for siege. Blue Jacket stormed out of the council lodge without waiting for formal dismissal. Half his warriors followed. Nightbear watched them go, his expression grave. When the council finally dispersed, he turned to Rachel. "You spoke well, dangerously well." "Meaning what?" "Meaning Blue Jacket now sees you not just as a symbol of weakness, but as an active threat. He'll assume you're manipulating me, using white tactics to undermine Modoc's strength." Nightbear's jaw tightened. "Which means he'll try to remove that threat." Fear spiked through Rachel's exhaustion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you'll have guards from now on. And I'm saying that when we travel to Fort Klamath in 3 days, you stay close to me. Blue Jacket won't move openly against you while I'm present, but accidents can happen on the trail." They walked back to the lodge in tense silence. Rachel's mind spun with the implications. She'd gone from being a passive victim to an active participant in a conflict she barely understood. Her words in the council had been honest, born from genuine belief that fighting the army directly was suicide. But she'd also inadvertently aligned herself firmly with Nightbear's faction. That night Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay on her platform, listening to the camp's night sounds, and wondered if her mother would be proud or horrified by what she was becoming. She'd gone from a souled bride to a political voice in less than a month, but the cost was mounting. She had enemies now, real ones, who saw her death as a solution to their problems. A sound outside the lodge made her freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with deliberate stealth. Rachel's hand found the knife Nightbear had given her for cutting hide, her heart hammering. The footsteps circled the lodge once, twice. Then voices, low and urgent in Modoc. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was planning, calculating. Then silence. The footsteps retreated. Rachel lay awake until dawn, knife clutched in her trembling hand. When Nightbear emerged from his sleeping area at first light, she told him about the night visitors. His expression darkened. They were testing, seeing if you were guarded, if you'd raise an alarm. He called for 2 warriors, men Rachel recognized as part of his personal guard, and stationed them outside the lodge. "From now on, you're never alone. Not in camp, not at the spring, nowhere." The next 2 days passed in tense preparation. Nightbear selected 6 men to accompany them to Fort Klamath, all proven warriors loyal to him personally. Willow Song helped Rachel prepare travel provisions and altered one of the buckskin dresses to be more suitable for riding. "You'll be representing us to the army," Willow Song said quietly. "You need to look like one of us, but also like yourself. Show them you've adapted without being conquered." The morning they were set to leave, Blue Jacket appeared at the edge of camp with a dozen armed warriors. For a moment, Rachel thought he meant to stop them by force. But instead, he approached Nightbear directly, his expression carefully neutral. "If you fail," Blue Jacket said, "if the army refuses negotiation and marches anyway, I will lead the defense of the lava beds. And I will not hold back because of white sentiment or fear of casualties. This is your warning." Nightbear met his cousin's stare without flinching. "If I fail, the defense is yours. But know this. If you attack settlers before the army gives you cause, if you spill blood without provocation, you'll start a war we cannot win. The Modoc will be wiped out, and our name will be cursed by survivors." Blue Jacket's smile was cold. "Some fates are worse than extinction. We'll see which one you've chosen for us." They rode out an hour later, heading north toward Fort Klamath. Rachel sat her horse awkwardly at first. She'd ridden before, but never for extended periods, and by midday her thighs were screaming. Nightbear set a punishing pace, stopping only briefly for water and to rest the horses. They traveled through country Rachel had never seen. High desert giving way to pine forest, then back to sagebrush flats that stretched to distant mountains. On the second day, they encountered a settler family heading south in a covered wagon. The man saw Nightbear and his warriors and immediately reached for his rifle. Nightbear raised his hand in a peaceful gesture, calling out in English, "We mean no harm. We're traveling to Fort Klamath on official business." The settler kept his rifle raised, but didn't fire. His wife clutched 2 small children to her chest, her eyes wide with terror as they fixed on Rachel. "You're white," the woman said, her voice shaking. "What are you doing with them?" Rachel urged her horse forward, acutely aware of how she must look, dressed in Modoc clothing, riding with warriors, her hair braided in tribal fashion. "I'm Rachel Colton. I'm married to Nightbear. We're seeking negotiation with the territorial government to prevent violence," the settler man spat. "Married? You mean captured. Savages don't marry, they take." His rifle swung toward Nightbear. "Let the woman go. And maybe we won't report this to the army." One of Nightbear's warriors drew his weapon, but Nightbear barked an order in Modoc, and the warrior reluctantly lowered it. Nightbear spoke slowly, his English careful. "The woman came to us legally, through territorial court documents. We're not raiders. We're seeking peace. You can verify this at Fort Klamath if you wish. We'll be there in 2 days." The settler looked skeptical, but his wife tugged at his arm, clearly terrified and wanting only to leave. They rode on after a tense minute, the settler glancing back repeatedly until they disappeared around a bend. "They'll spread word," one of Nightbear's men said grimly. "By tomorrow, every settler between here and Klamath will think we're riding to war." Nightbear nodded. "I know, which means we need to reach the fort before panic spreads. We ride through the night." They did, stopping only when the horses were near collapse. Rachel clung to her saddle in a haze of exhaustion and pain, every muscle screaming. When they finally made camp in a sheltered canyon, she slid from her horse and collapsed. Nightbear appeared with dried meat and water, crouching beside her. "You're doing better than I expected," he said. It might have been a compliment. Rachel forced herself to sit up and drink. "That family back there, they thought I was captive. The woman looked at me like I was already dead." Nightbear was quiet for a moment. "In her eyes, you probably are. White women who marry into tribes are seen as lost, as having crossed a line that can't be recrossed. Even if we succeed at Fort Klamath, even if we negotiate a lasting peace, you'll never be fully accepted by your people again." Rachel had known this on some level, but hearing it stated so boldly still hit like a physical blow. "So I'm trapped between worlds now. Not Modoc, not White." Nightbear met her eyes. "Yes, but that also makes you valuable. You can speak to both sides. You can translate not just words, but intentions. That's rare." He stood, preparing to take first watch. Rachel stared into the small fire, watching flames dance against canyon walls, and wondered if her mother had known this would be the cost of survival, not just endurance, but transformation into something neither world would fully claim. Fort Klamath rose from the high desert like a collection of weathered scars, rough timber palisades, squat buildings with sod roofs, and a flagpole flying the stars and stripes over a parade ground that was mostly mud and horse manure. Rachel had been here once before, 3 years ago, when her uncle brought supplies to trade, and she remembered thinking it looked more like a ramshackle trading post than a military installation. Now, approaching it from the north with Nightbear and his warriors, she saw it differently, as a fortified position capable of housing 200 soldiers, with artillery emplacements at each corner and clear sight lines across the surrounding flats. They'd been spotted half a mile out. Rachel watched soldiers scramble to positions along the palisade, rifles appearing at firing ports, and heard the distant shouts of officers marshalling their men. Nightbear raised his hand, signaling his warriors to stop well outside rifle range. He rode forward alone, then turned and gestured for Rachel to join him. Her horse trembled beneath her, picking up on her fear as they covered the final 200 yards at a walk. The main gate remained closed, but a side door opened and 3 men emerged. Rachel recognized Captain James Brevard immediately, tall, graying, with the rigid bearing of a career military man. Beside him stood a younger lieutenant she didn't know, and a civilian in an expensive suit who had to be some kind of territorial official. They stopped 20 feet from the gate, hands conspicuously away from their sidearms, but clearly ready to draw if needed. "That's far enough," Brevard called out. His eyes moved from Nightbear to Rachel, and his expression shifted from military alertness to confusion. "Miss Colton?" "Rachel Colton." Rachel's throat was so dry she could barely speak. "Yes, Captain. I'm here with my husband to request a meeting with the territorial governor." The word husband landed like a physical blow. The lieutenant actually stepped back, his hand moving toward his pistol, before Brevard shot him a warning glance. The civilian's face cycled through shock, disgust, and calculation so quickly Rachel almost missed the progression. Brevard found his voice first. "Your husband. You're claiming you married this Modoc of your own free will?" "I married him according to territorial law," Rachel said carefully. "My uncle Silas Colton arranged the union to settle a legal debt. Nightbear holds documentation from Judge Whitmore in Jacksonville. It was technically true, though it omitted the coercion that made the whole arrangement possible. But Rachel had spent the 3-day ride rehearsing this explanation with Nightbear, finding the version that was legally defensible even if morally complicated. The civilian stepped forward, pulling a notebook from his jacket. "I'm Edmund Stiles, deputy to Governor Grover. Judge Whitmore is under investigation for irregular land dealings, but that's separate from your situation." He studied Rachel with the clinical interest of a man examining a curiosity. "You're saying you willingly consummated a marriage with a Modoc war chief?" The question was designed to humiliate, and it succeeded. Rachel felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her voice level. "I'm saying I'm legally married according to territorial law, and I'm here representing my husband's people in their desire to negotiate peaceful terms regarding the proposed relocation." Nightbear spoke for the first time, his English formal and precise. "We're not here to debate personal matters. We're here because your government is preparing military action against my camp. We're offering negotiation as an alternative to bloodshed. If Governor Grover is truly interested in peaceful expansion, he'll hear our proposal." Brevard and Stiles exchanged glances. Rachel could see the calculation happening. They hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for Modoc emissaries arriving voluntarily with a white woman in tow. "The governor isn't here," Stiles said finally. "He's in Portland." But I have authority to hear preliminary proposals and relay them via telegraph. Nightbear shook his head. We don't negotiate with messengers. We need direct talks with decision-makers. We'll wait for the governor to arrive. Brevard's jaw tightened. That could take 2 weeks. You expect us to host a Modoc delegation at a military fort for 2 weeks? We expect you to honor the principle of parley, Nightbear replied. We came unarmed under truce, seeking peaceful resolution. If you refuse to engage in good faith, we'll return to the lava beds and interpret your refusal as a declaration of hostile intent. It was a brilliant tactical move, Rachel realized. By framing any rejection as the army's choice for violence, Nightbear put them in an impossible position. If they sent the delegation away, they looked like warmongers. If they hosted the talks, they implicitly recognized Modoc's sovereignty. Styles clearly understood this too, because his expression went carefully blank. I need to telegraph the governor, Styles said. Lieutenant Mason, escort these individuals to the civilian quarters. Not the guardhouse. I want no implication of imprisonment. Captain Brevard, assign guards for their protection, not detention. Make that distinction absolutely clear to your men. Brevard looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, but he nodded. Follow Lieutenant Mason. You'll be given quarters, meals, and freedom of movement within the fort's interior perimeter. Your weapons stay with the armory. Nightbear conferred briefly with his warriors in Modoc, then dismounted. Rachel slid from her horse with less grace, her legs nearly buckling after 3 days of hard riding. One of Nightbear's men, a warrior named Red Cloud, steadied her with a hand on her elbow, and she caught the flash of concern in his usually stoic expression. The delegation was led through the fort's interior, soldiers staring openly as they passed. Rachel heard muttered comments, most too quiet to make out, but the tone was clear enough, hostility mixed with prurient curiosity. The civilian quarters turned out to be a long barracks building, divided into small rooms, usually used for visiting officials or supply officers. Lieutenant Mason showed them to a section with 6 rooms, all opening onto a common area with a stove and table. Meals will be brought 3 times daily, he said stiffly. Privy is out back. You're free to move about the fort, but if you approach the armory, the stables, or the telegraph office, you'll be stopped. Questions? Nightbear had none. Mason left, and Rachel heard the unmistakable sound of guards taking position outside. The warriors immediately began checking the rooms for security, testing window bars, examining door locks. Nightbear pulled Rachel aside into one of the smaller rooms, his expression grave. This is more dangerous than the trail. We're surrounded by soldiers who see us as enemies. One incident, one perceived threat, and they'll have justification to arrest or kill us all. Rachel sank onto the narrow cot that served as the room's only furniture. Then why did we come? Why put ourselves in their hands? Because if we don't try negotiation, Blue Jacket wins the argument by default. The young warriors will demand blood, and we'll fight a war we can't survive. Nightbear moved to the barred window, looking out at the fort's parade ground. But there's another reason. I needed to see this place. Needed to understand their numbers, their weapons, their readiness. Now I know... Know what? Rachel asked. Nightbear turned back to her, and for the first time she saw something like fear in his eyes. That if it comes to war, we have perhaps 3 weeks before they can field enough troops to overwhelm the lava beds. Their artillery isn't ready. I saw only 2 field pieces, both in need of maintenance. Their cavalry mounts are poor quality, but they're drilling the infantry hard, and they've got supply wagons being loaded even now. Governor Grover has already decided on military action. This negotiation is theater. The words hit Rachel like cold water. Then why go through with it? Why not leave now? Because theater matters. When the army marches and Modoc resist, there will be newspapers, politicians, citizens asking if the violence was necessary. If we can show we tried every peaceful option, we create doubt. Doubt creates pressure. Pressure might force actual negotiation later, after the first battles prove costly. Nightbear's strategic thinking was several moves ahead, and Rachel struggled to keep up. So we're sacrificing ourselves as evidence? We're creating a record, he corrected. And I'm buying time for Blue Jacket to prepare defenses. A knock at the door interrupted them. Rachel opened it to find a soldier holding a tray with bread, salt pork, and coffee. The young man's eyes widened when he saw her. "Miss, are you here against your will? Because if you need help—" "I'm here by choice," Rachel cut him off, though the lie felt like ash in her mouth. "But thank you for your concern." The soldier looked unconvinced, but left the tray and departed. Rachel brought the food to the common area where Nightbear's warriors had gathered. They ate in tense silence, each man clearly on edge. Red Cloud finally voiced what they were all thinking. "We're trapped. If the governor refuses negotiation, we can't fight our way out. They'll kill us or imprison us, and the camp will have no leadership when the army marches." Nightbear shook his head. "If talks collapse, we'll have warning. Styles will need time to organize our detention or removal. In that window we leave. Not through the gate, through the north palisade, where the logs are rotted. I spotted it on the way in." Rachel stared at him. "You planned an escape route before we even entered." "I planned for every possibility," Nightbear said simply. "Hope for negotiation, prepare for betrayal." The first 2 days at Fort Klamath passed in agonizing slowness. Styles spent hours in the telegraph office, sending and receiving coded messages. Brevard drilled his troops with increased intensity, clearly preparing for deployment. Rachel was allowed to move freely through the fort, and she used that freedom to observe and listen. She visited the sutler's store, where civilian traders gossiped about troop movements and supply contracts. She walked past the barracks, hearing soldiers complain about the coming campaign. She even attended Sunday service at the fort's small chapel, where the chaplain preached about bringing civilization to savage lands. On the third day, a woman approached Rachel near the well. She was perhaps 40, weather-worn, dressed in the practical clothing of an officer's wife. "You're the Colton girl," she said without preamble. "The one who married the Modoc." Rachel nodded warily. The woman studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "My name is Margaret Brevard. Captain Brevard is my husband. I need you to understand something. When the army marches, and it will march, there are no halfway measures. The orders are clear: relocate by force if necessary. That means women and children will die alongside warriors. Do you understand what you've gotten yourself into?" Rachel felt ice form in her stomach. "I understand. I'm trying to prevent that outcome." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You can't prevent it. The governor needs this territory for railroad expansion. The Modoc are in the way. Your marriage doesn't change that. It just makes you complicit in the violence when it comes." She started to walk away, then paused. "If you have any influence over that man, convince him to accept relocation peacefully. The reservation is grim, but it's survival. War is annihilation." That night Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay on the narrow cot, Margaret Brevard's words echoing in her mind. Around midnight, she heard movement in the common area, quiet voices speaking Modoc. She rose and found Nightbear and Red Cloud examining a hand-drawn map by lamplight. Nightbear looked up when she entered. "Can't sleep either." Rachel shook her head. "Mrs. Brevard told me the army's orders include killing women and children if necessary." "Is that true?" "Yes," Nightbear said without hesitation. "The goal isn't relocation, it's elimination. They want the Modoc broken so completely we'll never resist again. Dead warriors, traumatized survivors, children raised on reservations where tribal identity is systematically destroyed. That's the actual plan." Rachel sank into a chair, feeling sick. "Then what are we doing here?" "Why go through this charade?" Red Cloud answered in halting English. "Because some fights you lose slowly. Give ground, preserve lives, wait for chance. Other fights you lose all at once. We choose slow." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. It was a philosophy of survival that Rachel was beginning to understand. Not victory, but endurance. Not winning, but refusing to be completely destroyed. On the morning of the fourth day, Edmund Styles summoned Nightbear to the captain's office. Rachel was explicitly not invited, but Nightbear insisted she attend as his translator, a transparent excuse since his English was better than most settlers, but it got her in the room. Styles sat behind Brevard's desk, looking tired and irritable. "The governor has responded," he said without preamble. "He's willing to offer the following terms. All Modoc relocate to the Klamath Reservation within 30 days. In exchange, you'll receive food rations for the first year, building materials for permanent structures, and a guarantee of safety from settler violence. Those who comply will face no criminal charges for past conflicts, and those who refuse," Nightbear asked, "will be removed by military force and imprisoned as hostiles." "The governor is being generous, Nathan. May I call you Nathan?" Styles leaned forward, trying for a reasonable tone. "These terms are better than you'd get after a military campaign." "Take them." Nightbear was silent for a long moment. "The Klamath Reservation is on bad land. The soil won't support crops. The water is alkaline. Tribes already there are starving. You're offering us a slower death than bullets, but it's death nonetheless." Styles's reasonable mask slipped. "It's what's being offered. Take it or face the consequences. I need to consult with my people," Nightbear said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Styles replied. "After that, the offer is withdrawn and military action proceeds immediately." They were dismissed. As they walked back to the civilian quarters, Rachel grabbed Nightbear's arm. "You can't seriously be considering accepting those terms." Nightbear kept walking, his expression unreadable. "I'm considering everything. The governor made his play, now I make mine." That evening, Nightbear sent Red Cloud out of the fort on a scouting mission. The warrior simply walked to the north palisade, found the rotted section Nightbear had spotted, and slipped through while the guards changed shift. He returned 3 hours later with crucial intelligence. Blue Jacket had moved the camp deeper into the lava beds, into the natural fortress of caves and canyons, where army artillery would be useless. He'd positioned scouts on every approach, and he was preparing for siege. "He knew we'd fail," Rachel said when Nightbear translated Red Cloud's report. "He knew the governor would refuse real negotiation." "Yes," Nightbear agreed. "But now we have proof. We tried. We offered peace. They rejected it on terms designed to ensure our destruction. That narrative matters." The next morning they returned to Brevard's office. Styles sat waiting, looking confident. "Have you decided to accept the governor's generous terms?" Nightbear's response was in Modoc first, translated for Styles by Rachel. "We reject your offer of slow death in favor of fighting for our homeland. We'll return to our people and prepare to defend the lava beds. If your army comes, it will find us ready. This is our final answer." Styles's confidence evaporated. "You're choosing war over peace." "We're choosing war over genocide," Nightbear corrected. "There's a difference." He stood. "We'll leave at dawn. I assume you'll provide us safe conduct as promised under parley rules." For a moment, Rachel thought Styles would refuse, would order their immediate arrest. But Brevard, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "You'll have safe conduct to the territorial boundary. After that, you're enemy combatants." His tone was almost regretful. "I wish you'd chosen differently." "I wish your government had given us a real choice," Nightbear replied. They were escorted to the stables at dawn, their weapons returned, their horses saddled. As Rachel mounted, she saw Margaret Brevard watching from the captain's quarters, her expression sorrowful. The woman raised one hand in what might have been farewell or warning. Then they were riding out the main gate, 6 Modoc warriors and 1 white woman, heading south toward a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. They'd covered perhaps 10 miles when Red Cloud, Riding Point, suddenly raised his fist, the signal for danger. Nightbear called a halt, and they gathered in a tight group. Red Cloud pointed to dust rising on the eastern horizon, riders, at least a dozen, moving fast to intercept them. "Army patrol?" Rachel asked. Nightbear shook his head grimly. "Wrong direction, and they're not in formation. Those are civilians." Understanding hit Rachel like a fist. "Settlers. Coming to stop us from reaching the camp." One of the warriors said something sharp in Modoc, and Nightbear responded quickly, gesturing. The group split, 3 warriors heading west to draw off pursuit, while Nightbear, Red Cloud, Rachel, and 2 others pushed south at a hard gallop. Behind them, shouts rose as the settler riders spotted them and gave chase. The next hour was a blur of desperate flight. Rachel clung to her horse, branches whipping at her face as they crashed through sage and juniper. Rifle shots cracked behind them, close enough that she heard bullets buzz past. One of the warriors took a round in the shoulder, but kept riding, his face locked in a grimace of pain. They reached broken ground, a maze of gullies and rock outcrops. A nightmare led them into the narrowest canyon he could find, a place where riders would have to go single file. "Here," he gasped, sliding from his horse. "We make our stand here." Red Cloud and the other warriors took positions on the high ground, rifles ready. Rachel crouched behind a boulder, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The settler riders appeared at the canyon mouth. 11 men, all armed, led by a rancher Rachel recognized from Fort Klamath. The rancher called out, "Send out the white woman, and the rest of you can go." Nightbear's response was to chamber around loudly enough for them to hear. The rancher tried again. "We don't want to kill you, Nathan. Just give us the girl. She's one of ours. You got no right keeping her. She's my wife, legally married." Nightbear shouted back. "You're interfering with the sanctioned parley. Stand down. She's a captive whether she admits it or not," the rancher yelled. "And we're taking her home." Rachel stood up before Nightbear could stop her. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she called out, her voice carrying across the canyon. "I'm here by my own choice. If you try to take me by force, you're no better than the traffickers who sell women to mining camps. Go home." The rancher's face darkened. "You've been brainwashed. Don't even know what's good for you anymore." He raised his rifle. "Last chance." Nightbear's shot took the rancher's hat clean off his head. The man stumbled backward, shocked. Red Cloud and the other warriors had their rifles aimed at different targets. The message was clear. First man to fire would die, and several of his friends would follow. The standoff lasted an eternity. Then one of the settlers, younger than the rest, lowered his weapon. "This ain't right, Tom. She says she's staying. We got no legal ground to take her. We ain't kidnappers," the rancher spat. "You're all making a mistake. When the war comes, she'll be caught in it. Her blood will be on your hands." But he was backing down, his companions losing their nerve for a firefight against entrenched opponents. They withdrew slowly, keeping their weapons ready, but they withdrew. Nightbear didn't relax until they'd been gone for 10 minutes. "That was foolish," he told Rachel, his voice tight with anger and something else. "They could have shot you. They could have shot all of us," Rachel countered. "But I'm the reason they didn't. My voice made them question their righteousness." Nightbear stared at her, and slowly his expression shifted. "You're learning," he said finally. "Learning what?" "How to be the bridge. The thing that makes both sides hesitate before burning everything down." They rode on, reaching the lava beds by nightfall. Blue Jacket met them at the camp's new location, deep in a canyon where the rocks formed natural fortifications. "The governor refused," he said. A statement, not a question. Nightbear nodded. "War is coming. We have perhaps 2 weeks before they march." Blue Jacket's expression was complex, vindication mixed with sorrow. "Then we prepare, and we make them pay for every inch." The lava beds were a landscape designed by violence, black volcanic rock twisted into grotesque formations, caves that descended into lightless depths, and canyons so narrow a man could touch both walls with outstretched arms. Blue Jacket had chosen the defensible heart of this maze, a natural amphitheater surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides, with only one narrow approach that could be covered by riflemen from elevated positions. When Rachel first saw the new camp, she understood immediately why Nightbear had allowed Blue Jacket to take tactical command. This wasn't just a defensive position, it was a fortress. The camp had transformed in the week they'd been gone. Women and children occupied the caves. Their cooking fires vented through natural chimneys in the rock that dispersed smoke before it could be spotted from a distance. Warriors had built stone blinds at every vantage point, stockpiled ammunition and water, and created fallback positions deeper in the cave system. Tallgrass Woman greeted Rachel with relief that bordered on desperation. "We thought you wouldn't return. Blue Jacket said the army would arrest you, that Nightbear had sacrificed himself for nothing." Rachel helped carry water from the hidden spring that made this position sustainable. The spring emerged from deep in the cave system, cold and clean, enough to support perhaps 80 people indefinitely if rationed carefully. Willowsong worked beside her, and Rachel noticed the young woman's hands shaking as she filled containers. "How long can we hold here?" Rachel asked quietly. Willowsong's answer was bleak. "Against infantry, months. Against artillery, days. The question is whether they'll risk bringing big guns through terrain that could swallow entire wagons." Nightbear and Bluejacket met in council that night, and for the first time since Rachel arrived, the two men seemed aligned in purpose, if not in philosophy. Bluejacket laid out the defensive strategy with tactical precision. "The approach canyon is our killing ground. We let them enter, then hit them from 3 sides. They'll take casualties and withdraw. We don't pursue. We make them come to us again and again until the cost becomes unacceptable." Nightbear added the political dimension. "Every day we hold is another day for newspapers to report the story. Rachel will write accounts of our position, our reasons for resistance. We'll get them to sympathetic traders, to missionaries, to anyone who might carry our side to the public." Rachel felt every eye turned to her. "You want me to be your chronicler?" "I want you to be our voice to the world your people listen to," Nightbear said. "Bluejacket's warriors can kill soldiers. You can kill the narrative that we're mindless savages deserving extermination." It was a role Rachel had never imagined, but she recognized its importance immediately. Wars weren't won just with bullets. They were won with public opinion, with political pressure, with making the cost of violence too high for governments to sustain. "I'll need paper, ink, something to write with." Willowsong produced a leather-bound journal and a pencil. "My mother's. She would want you to use it." Rachel opened the journal that night and began writing by firelight. She described the failed negotiation at Fort Klamath, the governor's terms that amounted to cultural genocide, the settler attack that proved Nightbear's claim of white hostility. She wrote about the families huddled in caves, about children who'd known nothing but conflict, about warriors prepared to die defending land their ancestors had occupied for generations. She wrote truthfully, but also strategically, framing the Modoc resistance not as savage violence, but as desperate self-defense. The army arrived 6 days later. Rachel was gathering firewood near the canyon mouth when Red Cloud gave the warning whistle. She dropped her bundle and scrambled to the nearest overlook. Below, stretching across the alkali flats, was a military column that made her stomach drop. At least 100 infantry, 20 cavalry, 3 supply wagons, and her heart clenched, 2 artillery pieces being dragged by mule teams. They'd brought the big guns after all. Nightbear appeared beside her, his face grim. "More than I expected. Brevard must have requested reinforcements from Fort Vancouver." Below, the column halted just outside rifle range. Soldiers began establishing a field camp with practiced efficiency. Tents rising, picket lines for horses, sentries posted. An officer rode forward alone, carrying a white flag. Bluejacket materialized from the rocks, rifle in hand. "It's a trick. It's procedure," Nightbear countered. "They'll offer one final chance to surrender. We listen, we refuse, then the killing starts." The officer stopped 50 yards from the canyon mouth and called out, "I'm authorized to accept your immediate surrender under the following terms. All warriors disarm and submit to military custody pending trial. Women and children will be escorted to the Klamath Reservation under armed guard. Anyone who complies will be treated according to the laws of war. This is your final opportunity." Nightbear stepped into view, and Rachel heard the sharp intake of breath from the officer who recognized him. "We reject your terms. This is our land by treaty and by right. We'll defend it. If you attack, the blood is on your hands." The officer's response was clipped and professional. "Then you're declared hostiles under territorial law. What happens next is your choice." He turned his horse and rode back to the army lines. Within the hour, the bombardment began. The first artillery shells screamed over the canyon and exploded against the cliff face behind the camp, showering rock fragments that wounded 2 women and terrified the children into screaming. Rachel pressed herself against the cave wall, hands over her ears, as the second and third shells followed. But Bluejacket had positioned the camp well. The artillery couldn't get the angle needed to hit the cave entrances directly, and the shells that struck the cliff face did more noise than damage. After a dozen shells, the bombardment stopped. The army was conserving ammunition, Rachel realized, or perhaps they'd recognized the futility of shelling a position they couldn't effectively target. What came next was worse, a coordinated infantry assault up the approach canyon. Rachel watched from her position as soldiers advanced in formation, using rocks for cover, moving with the discipline of trained troops. Blue Jacket's warriors held fire until the soldiers were halfway up the canyon, then opened up from 3 sides simultaneously. The sound was devastating. Rifle fire echoed and re-echoed off the canyon walls until it became a continuous roar. Rachel saw soldiers fall, saw others drag wounded comrades back toward cover, saw the neat formation dissolve into chaos as men realized they were caught in a deadly crossfire with no good options. An officer tried to rally his men for a push forward, and a Modoc bullet dropped him instantly. The soldiers broke and retreated, leaving 4 bodies behind. Blue Jacket's warriors didn't pursue. They held position, reloading, waiting. The army regrouped and tried again an hour later with the same result. Advance, take casualties, retreat. By sundown, they'd attempted 4 assaults and lost perhaps 15 men killed or seriously wounded. The Modoc had suffered 2 injuries, neither life-threatening. Blue Jacket was exultant. "They can't take us. The position is too strong." But Nightbear's expression remained troubled. "They're probing our defenses, learning our positions. Tomorrow they'll adapt." That night, Rachel wrote furiously by candlelight, documenting the assault, the casualties, the army's tactics. She wrote about the terror of children huddled in caves while shells exploded overhead, about warriors who fought not from bloodlust, but from the knowledge that surrender meant death or imprisonment. She filled 10 pages before exhaustion forced her to stop. Willow Song took the journal pages. "I'll get these to Thomas Chen, the Chinese trader who passes through regularly. He has connections to newspapers in San Francisco." Rachel grabbed her hand. "If he's caught with these, he'll be arrested as a conspirator." Willow Song's smile was sad. "Then we'd better make sure the story is worth the risk." The second day of siege brought new tactics from the army. Instead of frontal assault, they sent sharpshooters to elevated positions around the canyon, trying to pick off Modoc warriors who exposed themselves. It became a deadly game of patience, soldiers waiting for targets, warriors waiting for soldiers to make mistakes. Rachel found herself trapped in the cave system, unable to safely move outside. The children grew restless and frightened, their usual games subdued. One little girl, no more than 5, asked Rachel when the loud noises would stop. Rachel had no answer. On the 3rd day, the army tried fire. They launched flaming arrows into the canyon, hoping to ignite brush and smoke out the defenders. But the volcanic rock held little vegetation, and what did catch burned itself out quickly. Blue Jacket's warriors responded by targeting the army's water wagons during a resupply run, destroying one and contaminating another. Now both sides faced resource constraints. It was during the 4th day that everything changed. Rachel was helping treat a warrior's infected wound when shouting erupted from the canyon mouth. She emerged to find Nightbear and Blue Jacket in heated argument, their warriors choosing sides. "What's happening?" she asked Willow Song. The young woman's face was ashen. "A scout returned. The army sent riders to the reservation. They've arrested the Modoc families already there as hostages. They're threatening to execute them if we don't surrender." The council convened immediately in the largest cave, every warrior and elder present. Blue Jacket argued for continuing the fight. "They're bluffing. The army won't massacre women and children in front of witnesses." Nightbear disagreed. "You don't know these men the way I do. Brevard is career military. He'll follow orders. And those orders will be to use any leverage necessary." Grey Cloud, the eldest, spoke with the weight of years. "How many families are held?" 23 people, Nightbear replied. "Mostly elderly and children. The women who were deemed too sick to fight." Rachel felt the moral calculus crushing down on everyone present. Continue fighting and potentially cause the execution of innocents, or surrender and face certain death or imprisonment. There was no good choice. Bluejacket's voice cut through the debate. If we surrender, we all die. If we fight, perhaps 23 die, but the rest survive and resist. That's not a choice, it's mathematics. Nightbear rounded on him. Those 23 include your aunt, my uncle, children who've done nothing but exist. You're willing to sacrifice them. I'm willing to recognize that surrender sacrifices everyone. Bluejacket shot back. At least this way, some live. The argument spiraled, voices rising, hands moving toward weapons. Rachel saw the camp fragmenting in real time, the fragile unity of the siege dissolving under impossible pressure. And then she heard herself speaking, her voice cutting through the chaos. There's a third option. Every head turned toward her. Rachel's mouth was dry, but she continued. Let me go to the army. Let me negotiate for the hostages' release. I'm white. I'm legally married to Nightbear. I have some protection under law. If I can get to a newspaper, to someone outside Brevard's chain of command, I can make this public. The army won't execute hostages if they know the newspapers are watching. The silence was absolute. Then Bluejacket laughed, harsh and bitter. The white woman wants to save us. How perfectly ironic. But Nightbear was staring at Rachel with an expression she couldn't read. They'd never let you leave once you're in their camp. You'd be used as a hostage yourself. Maybe, Rachel agreed. But I'm more valuable to them as a symbol than as a prisoner. If they parade me around as a rescued captive, it justifies their campaign. But if I speak out, if I tell the truth about the governor's terms and the army's tactics, I become a problem they can't easily solve. Greycloud leaned forward. You would risk this? For people not your own? Rachel met the old man's eyes. They're my people now. That's what marriage means, isn't it? The council voted. Nightbear cast the deciding vote in favor, though Rachel could see it cost him something to do so. That night, as she prepared for the morning departure, he found her in her sleeping area. This is foolish and brave and possibly suicidal, he said. I know, Rachel replied, but it's also the only move they won't expect. That gives it a chance of working. Nightbear pulled something from his vest, her mother's jade hairpin, the one she'd given him during the marriage ceremony. Take this. If you get into true danger, if you need to send a message back to us, give this to Thomas Chen. He'll know it means you need extraction. Rachel took the pin, her hand trembling. Thank you. For voting, yes. For letting me try. Nightbear's expression was complicated. Fear and respect and something deeper he didn't voice. Come back alive. We need our bridge. At dawn, Rachel walked out of the canyon alone, carrying a white cloth tied to a stick. She'd gone perhaps 100 yards when soldiers emerged from cover, rifles trained on her. Captain Brevard himself came forward, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Miss Colton. You're surrendering? I'm negotiating, Rachel corrected. And we need to talk about those hostages before anyone else dies. Captain Brevard's tent was austere, a folding desk, a camp bed, maps weighted with stones, and the pervasive smell of canvas and gun oil. Rachel stood before the desk while Brevard studied her with the clinical detachment of a man examining a tactical problem. Edmund Stiles sat in the corner, notebook open, his expression caught between fascination and calculation. 2 guards flanked the entrance, rifles at the ready, though Rachel posed no physical threat. You walked out of a besieged position to negotiate, Brevard said finally. That takes either extraordinary courage or extraordinary foolishness. Which is it, Miss Colton? Rachel kept her voice steady, despite the fear coiling in her gut. It's recognition that 23 people will die if someone doesn't try something different. I'm told you're holding Modoc families at the reservation as hostages. Stiles interrupted smoothly. Protective custody. We're keeping them safe from the violence their relatives are perpetrating by threatening to execute them if the warriors don't surrender. Rachel shot back. That's not protection, Mr. Stiles. That's using civilians as weapons of war. Brevard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Discomfort, perhaps, or recognition that the moral ground here was swampy. The territorial governor authorized all necessary measures to resolve this conflict. Those measures include leveraging our position to minimize overall casualties. Minimize casualties, Rachel repeated, her voice rising despite her attempt at control. "You've killed 15 soldiers in 4 days, trying to take a position you'll never capture by direct assault. The Modoc have lost 2 wounded. Your mathematics of minimization seems flawed, Captain." The bluntness of it seemed to catch Brevard off guard. Styles started to object, but Brevard raised a hand. "Continue, Miss Colton. You came here with a proposal. Let's hear it." Rachel had rehearsed this during the sleepless night before her departure, but speaking the words aloud still felt like stepping off a cliff. "Release the hostages at the reservation. Publicly announce their release and guarantee their safety. In exchange, the warriors in the lava beds agree to a ceasefire while I attempt to arrange genuine negotiation. Not the sham you offered at Fort Klamath, but real discussion of land rights and compensation." Styles laughed outright. "You're in no position to dictate terms. You're a hostage yourself, whether you admit it or not. We could simply hold you here and proceed with our original plan." "You could," Rachel agreed. "But then you'd have to explain to the newspapers why you're holding a white woman against her will while claiming to rescue her from savages. The contradiction might prove difficult. The threat landed exactly as intended." Styles's laughter died, and Brevard's jaw tightened. Rachel pressed her advantage. "I'll make you a counteroffer. Let me travel to Jacksonville with an army escort. Let me speak to Governor Grover directly, in the presence of newspaper reporters. I'll tell the truth about the failed negotiation, about the terms you offered that amounted to cultural elimination, about the hostages you're holding. The public can decide whether your actions are justified." Brevard stood abruptly. "That's enough. Guards, escort Miss Colton to the medical tent. She'll be held there until we determine her status." As the guards moved to take her arms, Rachel played her final card. "I've already sent written accounts to 3 newspapers in San Francisco. They'll publish within the week. You can silence me, but you can't silence what's already in motion." It was a bluff. Thomas Chen had the documents, but no guarantee they'd reach their destination. But Brevard didn't know that. He exchanged a long look with Styles, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Styles spoke. "Give us 1 hour. We need to telegraph the governor." Rachel was escorted to the medical tent, which smelled of carbolic and blood. Wounded soldiers lay on cots, some unconscious, others watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. An army surgeon was amputating a soldier's mangled leg when Rachel entered, and she had to turn away from the sight, her stomach heaving. The surgeon noticed her distress and gestured to a stool in the corner. "Sit before you faint. I don't need another patient." Rachel sat, hands trembling. Around her, wounded men groaned or called out for water or morphine. One young soldier, barely 20, grabbed her wrist as she passed his cot. "You're her. The one who married the Modoc chief." His grip was weak but insistent. "Tell me why. Why would you choose them over your own people?" Rachel looked at his fever-bright eyes, at the bandage wrapped around his torso where a Modoc bullet had likely punctured his lung, and felt the crushing weight of being caught between worlds. "Because someone has to choose bridge over chasm," she said quietly. "Because if both sides only choose their own, nothing survives but graves." The soldier's grip loosened, and he fell back against his pillow, whether from weakness or contemplation Rachel couldn't tell. The hour stretched to 2, then 3. Rachel dozed fitfully on the stool, jerking awake each time a wounded man cried out. Finally, as dusk painted the tent walls orange, Brevard appeared. His expression was unreadable. "The governor has agreed to your proposal with modifications. You'll travel to Jacksonville with an escort of 6 soldiers. You'll meet with Governor Grover in a public forum, a town hall, not a private office. Newspaper reporters will be present. In exchange, the Modoc warriors agreed to a 14-day ceasefire. No attacks, no movement from their position. If they violate the ceasefire, the hostages at the reservation will face immediate prosecution for conspiracy." It wasn't what Rachel had asked for, but it was more than she'd expected. "And the hostages? Their status during the ceasefire? Remain in protective custody, but with improved conditions and access to medical care. If negotiation succeeds, they'll be released. If it fails, they'll be tried alongside the warriors. Brevard's tone made clear he expected failure. Rachel nodded slowly. I'll need to return to the lava beds to inform Nightbear of the terms and ensure his agreement to the ceasefire. Brevard shook his head. Absolutely not. We're not letting you walk back into that camp. You'll write the terms, and we'll send a messenger under white flag. They won't trust a message from an army courier, Rachel protested. They'll assume it's a trick or that I'm writing under duress. Then include something in the message that proves it's genuinely from you, Stiles suggested from the tent entrance. He handed Rachel paper and pencil. Something only you would know to write. Rachel took the materials, thinking carefully. She wrote out the ceasefire terms in simple language, then added a final line in Modoc, phonetic, since she didn't know the written script, but close enough that Nightbear would recognize the attempt. Tukashwash Numesh Kenny. The phrase Willow Song had taught her that meant the bridge still stands. The message was sent at dawn with a junior lieutenant carrying a white flag. Rachel watched from the medical tent as the young man rode toward the canyon, dismounted at the approach, and walked forward, alone. He disappeared from view for long minutes, and Rachel's heart hammered. If Blue Jacket had seized control during her absence, if he'd decided the ceasefire was capitulation, the lieutenant might not emerge alive. But finally, the officer reappeared, walking backward with his hands visible, and mounted his horse only when he was well clear of rifle range. He returned to camp with a single-word response from Nightbear. Agreed. Relief flooded through Rachel so intensely her knees buckled. The surgeon caught her arm, steadied her. Easy, when did you last eat? Rachel couldn't remember. The surgeon brought her hardtack and coffee, both of which tasted like salvation. As she ate, Margaret Brevard appeared, carrying a bundle of clothing. If you're going to Jacksonville to speak to the governor, you can't do it in Modoc dress. You'll need proper attire. The clothing was simple but clean, a dark wool skirt, white blouse, and a practical jacket. Rachel changed in the privacy of a supply tent, and when she emerged, she caught her reflection in a polished metal wash basin. She looked like herself again, or rather, like the girl she'd been before Silas sold her to settle his debts. The dissonance was profound. The journey to Jacksonville took 3 days through mountain passes, still choked with late spring snow. Rachel rode in the center of the military escort, 6 soldiers who maintained professional distance but watched her constantly. They camped at night in clearings chosen for defensibility, and Rachel slept poorly, aware of sentries pacing the perimeter and wildlife moving through the darkness beyond firelight. On the second evening, the escort commander, a Lieutenant Marsh who'd barely spoken during the journey, sat across the fire from her and asked the question she'd been expecting. Do you actually believe they'll honor the ceasefire, or are you buying them time to reinforce their position? Rachel met his gaze directly. I believe Nightbear wants to avoid more death if possible. Blue Jacket wants to fight to the last warrior. Which impulse wins depends partly on whether Governor Grover offers anything worth preserving peace for. Marsh nodded slowly. Captain Brevard thinks you've been indoctrinated, that the Modoc have broken you somehow, convinced you their cause is righteous. He poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. Have they? The question was more complex than Marsh probably intended. Rachel considered her answer carefully. I've learned that righteousness isn't a simple calculation. The Modoc have legitimate grievances, stolen land, broken treaties, terms designed to destroy their culture. But they've also raided settlements and killed civilians. The settlers have built homes and risked everything for a better life, but they've done it on land taken through legal theft. Everyone has cause, and everyone has blood on their hands. That's not an answer, Marsh pointed out. It's the only honest answer, Rachel replied. If you're looking for me to say one side is pure and the other evil, you'll be disappointed. Jacksonville emerged from the forest like something from a different world. Actual streets, wooden buildings with glass windows, and the unmistakable sound of civilization in the form of wagon traffic and human voices raised in commerce. Rachel had forgotten what towns looked like, what they smelled like. sawdust and horse manure and wood smoke, and humanity packed close together. The escort led her to the territorial building, a two-story structure that served as courthouse, administrative center, and occasional meeting hall. Governor Grover waited in his office, and Rachel's first impression was of a man utterly unprepared for the complications she represented. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the ambitious energy of a political climber who'd viewed the Modoc conflict as a minor obstacle on his path to higher office. Now, confronted with a white woman who'd married into the tribe and was demanding public negotiation, he looked like a man who'd opened a door to find an unexpected precipice. "Miss Colton," he began, then corrected himself. "Or should I say Mrs. Whitfield?" Using Nightbear's English name was a calculated gesture, acknowledging the marriage while keeping emotional distance. Rachel responded in kind. "Rachel will suffice, Governor. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Grover gestured to a chair and Rachel sat. Styles was present, along with two men Rachel didn't recognize, lawyers, she guessed, based on their suits and the way they hovered with notebooks ready. The governor folded his hands on his desk. "I'll be frank, Rachel. This situation has become a political nightmare. You've managed to turn what should have been a simple relocation into a cause célèbre. Newspapers in San Francisco are publishing your accounts under headlines like "White Woman Defends Savage Rights" and "Governor's Peace Terms Revealed as Cultural Genocide." My political opponents are using this against me. I apologize for the inconvenience of having to justify your policies publicly, Rachel said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Perhaps if those policies weren't designed to destroy an entire people, you'd have less difficulty explaining them. One of the lawyers started to object, but Grover waved him silent. "You've got spirit, I'll grant you that. But spirit doesn't change reality. The territorial legislature has allocated that land for railroad expansion. The companies building the transcontinental line need access to the lava beds region for mineral extraction and right-of-way. The Modoc are a legal obstacle to economic development that will benefit thousands. So your position is that economic development justifies ethnic cleansing," Rachel said flatly. "I just want to be clear on the moral framework we're working within." Grover's expression hardened. "My position is that progress sometimes requires difficult choices. The Modoc can't halt the expansion of American civilization because they've occupied land for generations. Every territory faces this challenge as it develops, and every territory that has solved it through extermination has left a legacy of shame," Rachel countered. "Surely a man of your political ambition understands how history will judge the architect of the Modoc genocide." The word genocide landed like a physical blow. Grover stood abruptly, paced to the window. "You're very good at moral condemnation. Do you have any practical suggestions? Or did you come here simply to accuse me of being a monster?" Rachel took a steadying breath. "I came to propose actual negotiation. Not relocation to a barren reservation, but a compromise that acknowledges both Modoc rights and territorial development needs." "I'm listening," Grover said. Though his skepticism was evident, Rachel laid out the proposal she'd crafted with Nightbear during those long evenings in his lodge. The Modoc retain a portion of the lava beds, the section with the caves and springs that's culturally significant and strategically defensible. In exchange, they cede the western flats that the railroad wants for mineral rights. They receive compensation for the ceded land, enough to build permanent structures and establish sustainable agriculture on the retained territory. And they receive guaranteed protection from settler violence, enforced by federal marshals, not local militia. One of the lawyers spoke up immediately. "The railroad companies won't accept partial access. They want the entire region. Then the railroad companies can negotiate with the Modoc directly," Rachel said. "Treat them as sovereign landholders with the right to sell or refuse sale. That's how you'd handle any other property owner." Styles leaned forward. "Except they're not property owners under territorial law. They're occupants without legal title. They're occupants with treaty rights that predate territorial law," Rachel shot back. Rights your government acknowledged and then systematically violated. If you want to be legally precise, let's examine the actual documentation. The argument spiraled into technical details about treaty language, land surveys, and jurisdictional questions that made Rachel's head spin. But through it all, she recognized a shift happening. Grover and his advisors were actually engaging with the proposal rather than dismissing it outright. Not because they'd developed sudden moral clarity, but because the political cost of continued conflict was becoming untenable. Finally, Grover called a halt. "This is beyond my authority to resolve in one meeting. I need to consult with the legislature, with the railroad companies, with federal authorities." "That takes time." "How much time?" Rachel asked. "We have 11 days left on the ceasefire. Then I suggest you return to the lava beds and inform your husband that patience will be required," Grover said. "I'm not promising success, Rachel, but I'm promising a genuine attempt at negotiation. That's more than you had before." It wasn't victory, but it was possibility. Rachel stood, preparing to leave, when Grover added one final observation. "You've changed something here that can't be unchanged. Whether this negotiation succeeds or fails, you've made it impossible to simply exterminate the Modoc quietly. There will be witnesses now, records, accountability. I'm not certain whether to thank you or curse you for that. History will make that judgment," Rachel replied. "I'm just trying to ensure there's enough people left alive to read the history." She was escorted back to Fort Klamath that night, arriving exhausted and uncertain. Brevard met her with an expression she couldn't read. "Did it work?" Rachel shook her head. "I don't know yet. But I bought us time. Now we see if time is enough." Rachel returned to the lava beds on the 8th day of the ceasefire, escorted by Lieutenant Marsh and 2 soldiers who looked deeply uncomfortable about approaching the Modoc position unarmed. Nightbear met them at the canyon mouth, his expression unreadable until the soldiers withdrew and Rachel was finally alone with him. Then something in his face cracked, relief perhaps, or the release of tension he'd been holding since she'd walked into the army camp over a week ago. "You survived," he said simply. Rachel managed a tired smile. "I survived, and I bought us possibility. Not certainty, but possibility." She briefed him on the Jacksonville meeting as they walked deeper into the camp, describing Governor Grover's political calculations and the framework she'd proposed. Nightbear listened without interrupting, his tactical mind already processing implications. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You've done something unprecedented. Whether it works or not, you've changed the terms of engagement." The camp had transformed during her absence. The initial siege mentality had given way to something more sustainable, but also more fragile. Warriors maintained watch rotations, but with decreasing vigilance as the ceasefire held. Blue Jacket's faction remained separate, occupying the eastern caves, and Rachel could feel the tension whenever warriors from the 2 groups crossed paths. On the morning of the 14th day, a rider approached under white flag. Rachel's heart hammered as she watched Lieutenant Marsh dismount and hand Nightbear a sealed document. Nightbear broke the seal, read silently, then looked at Rachel with an expression she couldn't interpret. He handed her the letter without comment. Governor Grover's proposal was complex, but Rachel passed the essential terms. The Modoc would retain 1,200 acres of the lava beds, including the cave system and primary springs. They would cede the western flats for compensation of $8,000, paid over 4 years. Federal marshals would establish a permanent station to enforce protection from settler violence. And crucially, the Modoc would be recognized as a sovereign tribal nation with the right to self-governance under federal oversight. It wasn't everything they'd fought for, but it was survival. It was recognition. It was a future that didn't end in extermination. "What do you think?" Nightbear asked quietly. Rachel looked at him, at this man who'd been forced to accept her as a political strategy and had somehow become her partner in an impossible negotiation. "I think it's better than war. I think your children will grow up knowing these caves, speaking their language, learning from elders. I think 20 years from now, there will still be Modoc people because of what you choose today." Nightbear called an immediate council. Every warrior, every elder, every adult in the camp gathered to hear the terms. The debate was fierce. Blue Jacket spoke passionately against acceptance. This was surrender disguised as compromise. Others argued for acceptance. Any future was better than none. Grey Cloud finally called for silence. The old man stood with difficulty, his weathered face grave. I have lived 70 winters. I have watched our world shrink year by year. This offer is bitter. It tastes of loss and compromise. But it is also breath in our lungs, children's laughter, the possibility of grandchildren who will know they are Modoc. I vote to accept. The final count was close. 23 for acceptance, 17 against. Blue Jacket stood, his face a mask of betrayal and grief. You've chosen survival over honor. He walked out, and half his warriors followed. Nightbear let them go, knowing that forcing them to stay would fracture the fragile consensus. The formal signing took place at Fort Klamath 3 days later. Governor Grover arrived with lawyers and territorial officials. Nightbear brought Grey Cloud, Rachel, and 6 warriors as witnesses. When it came time to sign, Nightbear's hand hesitated only briefly before committing ink to paper. Rachel signed as witness and felt the weight of what they'd accomplished and what they'd lost. The army withdrew from the lava beds within the week. The Modoc began the slow work of rebuilding, constructing permanent structures, establishing agriculture, adapting to a world that had shrunk but still offered possibility. 6 months after the signing, Rachel stood at the edge of the lava beds, watching sunset paint the rocks crimson and gold. Nightbear joined her, and they stood in comfortable silence. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. "Being sold into this life?" Rachel considered the question honestly. "I regret how I came here. I'll always regret that my choice was stolen. But what I've become, what we've built, I don't regret that." Nightbear nodded slowly. Blue Jacket left yesterday, took 5 warriors and headed for the Northern Territories. He couldn't accept this compromise. Will he come back? I don't know. But the children are learning to read and write in both languages. The elders are teaching the old stories. We're still here. That has to count for something. Rachel took his hand, a gesture that had become natural over months of partnership. It counts for everything. We built a bridge when everyone said only chasms were possible. Nightbear smiled, rare and genuine. The bridge still stands, And as night fell over the lava beds, Rachel thought of her mother's letter, of the girl she'd been, of the woman she'd become. She'd survived not by escaping her cage, but by transforming it, by refusing to accept that powerlessness was her only option. The frontier would continue its brutal expansion. But here, in this specific place, at this specific moment, a bridge had held. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.